Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. It's really wonderful to be with you here today in your beautiful campus. So people have warned me. It's not always like this, but it's very pretty today. So thank you so much. The paper that I'm going to present today is Dain's joint work with Fernando Martel. We are very close to bringing a third co-author, Pablo Fernandez. For reasons that I can talk at the end of the project, this has been a really, really long project, and we very much want to wrap it up, so your feedback will be really useful in that sense. So to motivate a little bit here what we're trying to do with this project, I want to start by saying that with the third wave of democratization, there was some hope that recurring elections would actually become an instrument for voters to keep their politicians accountable in Latin America. And as a consequence, countries could potentially break with vicious cycles that had prevented them from developing, like corruption. Now, some of the countries in the region are now going through its most democratic lapse ever, yet it turns out that corruption is pretty resilient. So the recurring abuse of public resources and the frequency of impunity of public officials has led to really historically high levels of perceptions of corruption in the region. So just to give you a sense, data from the Latino Barometer shows that in average in the region, about 60% of people would say that they agree or strongly agree that local politicians are all corrupt. There are some countries that are doing better in this aspect, like Uruguay. But today I'm going to be talking about the case of Mexico, where the percent of people that say all local politicians are corrupt is almost at the 80% level. So perceptions of corruption are really, really high. And typically, when we think about electoral accountability, we think about the role of elections in disciplining politicians. And so I've done that in some of my previous work too. In this project, we want to look at a different aspect of this question of accountability. We want to see what is the effect of intrastate accountability. I'll talk more about what that is in a second. We have two interrelated questions here. First, we want to see whether central and local auditors are different in their effectiveness to detect and sanction corruption. And then we want to see how local governments respond to these two different types of auditors. So what I want to do in the rest of my talk is talk very briefly about the limits of electoral accountability and highlight the importance of intrastate accountability. And then I'll spend most of my time talking about a field experiment we conducted with the Federal Auditor's Office in Mexico. And what I'm going to show you, based on audit reports produced by the auditors, is that indeed central auditors are more effective at detecting corruption and recovering money from local governments. But then I'm also going to show you that local governments, in turn, respond to harsher auditors by displacing spending. And displacing spending from areas of spending that are easier to audit, like public works, to areas that are more difficult to audit, like social assistance. And then I'm going to show you some preliminary evidence on why we're seeing this effect on spending based on a survey that we conducted among public officials in municipalities. Okay, so just to say a few words about the limits of electoral accountability. So in models of electoral competition, we tend to think that elections give power to voters to control their politicians. Now, the problem that is very well sort of understood right now is, like in any other principal agent problem, we have moral hazard and adverse selection crippling accountability. And then the other challenge, specifically in the case of Mexico, at the point when we were designing this experiment, with term limits, it turns out that when governments have exhausted their time in office, well, electoral accountability unravels because there is no re-election. And even if electoral accountability worked perfectly, we tend to assume that disciplining the elected official would be enough to discipline the whole government. But it turns out that there's a step that we're missing, so how to discipline the non-elected bureaucrat working for the politician. So this is where non-electoral accountability comes into the picture. So by intrastate accountability, what I mean is the network of agencies of the state that are in charge of overseeing and sanctioning misbehavior by public officials. For Guillermo O'Donnell, this network of oversight was called horizontal accountability, and he thought that the weakness of this system of oversight, or the complete absence of this type of oversight, was one of the defining characteristics of delegative democracies. For Mainwaring, for instance, also this type of horizontal accountability is pretty important to understand the workings and the deficiencies of Latin American democracies. These agencies can have both direct and indirect effects on the behavior of local governments. The direct effects are pretty straightforward, so these agencies can, through their oversight mechanisms, detect, report, in some cases sanction, or in some cases initiate a sanction of public officials. And what this does is reduce the rents available for rent seeking. On the other hand, these agencies can have an indirect effect. And this is because these agencies produce information that can help, say, a principal in abstract terms, discipline the agent. So they produce information that helps figure out, for instance, voters, how are governments performing, or it could help out someone in the higher ranks of the bureaucracy to figure out how lower ranked bureaucrats are performing. Here, the disciplining would depend on the reaction of the principals, and it's something that we don't understand very well yet. So for the most part, work on this area has thought about voters as principals, including some of my work, and it could very well be that this has nothing to do with voters, but with other levels of government or with other branches of the political party. So this is something that we're interested in exploring. Now, one thing that I should note is that it is not the case that oversight would immediately improve welfare of voters. Indeed, the effect could be quite ambiguous. So, for instance, Guillermo O'Donnell was pretty worried that oversight would actually reduce government effectiveness. And the reason why he was worried is that he was thinking in a situation in which you have a very strict, say, auditor's office, which produces paralysis in the bureaucracy, because no one wants to do anything because they know that the auditors are so harsh that it's very hard to get a clean report from them. So in that case, more oversight doesn't lead to efficiency, it leads to paralysis or underspending. So he was particularly worried with that. And another important aspect here is that public officials, in response to oversight systems, can be very creative and displays their wrongdoings in a way that it's harder for the auditors to detect corruption. And in that case, not only you don't deal with the problem of corruption, but it becomes even more distortionary. So just to say that more oversight doesn't necessarily mean more welfare for voters. So there are many questions that are open about these intrastate accountability systems. We focus on a few of them. The first we're focusing is on this idea of decentralized auditors and whether decentralized auditors are more effective than central auditors. And here the literature on decentralization would suggest on one hand that, well, local auditors have more local information, so in that sense they could be more effective at detecting and dealing with corruption. But on the other hand, local auditors could also be potentially more sensitive to local politics. So on that sense, central auditors could be more insulated from local pressures, and that would make them more effective to detect and sanction corruption. In the particular case that we are studying here, central auditors have more resources, both financial and human capital resources, than local auditors. So that led us to believe that, if anything, central auditors would be more effective than local auditors, despite the advantage of local auditors of having more access to local information. Now, in terms of how governments would respond to central and local auditors, we were not clear on which effect was going to dominate, whether more oversight would deter corruption, but on the other hand, more oversight would lead local governments to try to figure out ways in which they could comply with the law, but at the same time don't lose rent-seeking opportunities. So we didn't know which effect was going to win. But we did expect that central auditors were going to, if anything, have a bigger effect than local auditors, which we presume were going to be less effective. Now, finally, on the question of why would there be any effect on local governments' reactions to auditors, the federal auditors themselves, so the office that we work with, had this argument that if there was any effect, it was through soft touch strategies. So in a way, the experience of being audited was a way to transmit knowledge and capacity to local governments, so that because they're audited, they learn how they should have been doing things, and so that would improve performance of local governments. On our end, we had other theories about why this could happen. So one of our arguments was that maybe this was all running through career concerns. And I'll talk more about that towards the end of the talk, or simply through rent-seeking opportunities. Okay, so a little bit of context about Mexico, and specifically municipalities in Mexico. So municipalities are in charge of providing basic public services to the population, so like drinking water, sanitation, local roads, and electricity. And access to these services remains uneven, both across states and within states. And just to give you a general sense of the state of provision of these services, in Mexico, about 10 million people either lack access to electricity, improved sanitation, or safe water. Now, 10 million people is roughly the population of Portugal, or roughly the population of Bolivia. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. Municipalities collect very little taxes, and most of the investment in public works is funded through federal transfer schemes. I'm going to be studying one in particular called the Social Infrastructure Scheme that is supposed to be funding precisely these types of public goods in municipalities. One very important issue is that investments are heavily concentrated on the head of the municipality. So outlying municipalities receive very little investment in this type of infrastructure. And also, a big chunk of these resources are concentrated on paving local roads and filling baches. So people that have been to the region know what a bache is. So a lot of these resources get directed towards that type of public work. So corruption, of course, remains a problem, as I was suggesting at the beginning. But just to put a little bit more context into this, the Mexican chapter of International Transparency in 2011 detected 200 million incidences of corruption in public service delivery. This is more specifically incidences of bribery, specifically to access public services at the 3 levels of government. The average price of a mordida, or a bribe, was 165 pesos. I should definitely update this based on the new exchange rate, so it has become cheaper to bribe in US dollars. Households spend about 14% of their income in bribes, and it turns out that this type of corruption is actually regressive, so poor households spend 33% of their income in bribes. Now, I do not want to leave you with the sense that Mexico is the only corrupt country in the region, and so this is why I'm showing you this map, just to remind you that this is a problem for many other countries. This is the World Bank's map on controls of corruption. So here, dark red represents the lowest controls of corruption, and light yellow, the highest controls of corruption. So just to show you that Mexico in no way is an outlier with this particular problem. Okay, so we collaborated with the Federal Auditor's Office to embed a field experiment in their national program of audits. So we worked at the margins of this national program of audits, and what we did was assign a group of municipalities to be audited by the federal auditor, by a federal auditor. We assign another group of municipalities to be audited by a state auditor. Now, both federal and state auditors work in the national program of audit. So this is a usual thing that happens with the Federal Auditor's Office, in that they do directly some of the audits and then they outsource some of the audits to the state offices, because they don't have the capacity to do a big number of audits by themselves. There?
Is the federal level of auditors, is it in like a single office, a single bureau, or like under the same direction, like the same director, or?
Yes. So the Federal Auditor's Office is one office that is independent in the federal bureaucracy. The federal auditor is appointed for, I think, 8 years, with a chance to be re-elected once, and there have been 3 federal auditors so far. So it's a pretty professionalized and independent office yet. Okay, so we work with them on the selection of the audits, but they rolled out the audits exactly how they would do in any other year. So the role of their auditors is to go to the municipalities, and so here I'm charting the process of a regular audit, either federal or or local. So the auditor gets to the municipality, it starts studying the accounts of the municipality, it collects a list of public works and actions that the municipality funded in the previous fiscal year. And then for projects that have some infrastructure, there is a physical visit of the public work, and auditors in their team, they have engineers, so they go and measure the quality and quantity of construction materials, and they compare that to the market value of those materials. So they have a pretty sort of systematic way of assessing the quality of public works. In the case of actions funded by the municipality, they study the paper trail of the actions, but it's very hard to audit beyond that. So for instance, if a municipality pays 1,000 school lunches, the only thing that the auditor can do is check the paper trail for that particular type of program. So based on their visits and the study of the books of the municipality, the auditors produce recommendations or remarks, recommendations in case they find minor issues with the spending, remarks when they find something more serious. And then, and this is particularly interesting in the process of auditing, they give municipalities a chance to respond to those observations or remarks. So this is a point in the audit system in which municipalities have an opportunity to return money. Right. So for instance, if the municipality included in the program the acquisition of an ambulance, and the auditor finds no ambulance in the municipality, which is very common actually, so then the municipality has a few options. They can either return the money for the ambulance or produce an ambulance, or do nothing and then deal with the remark that there is some missing funding. So after they have a chance to respond, then there is the production of the actual reports, where there is the final opinion of the auditors, and in the worst case, that opinion can be the beginning of a judicial process against the municipality. And then all the audit reports are made public at the same time and presented to the lower house of Congress in Mexico. Right, so we had a convenience sample across 17 states of municipalities, and in this convenience sample, I can talk more in the Q&A if you want about exactly how we came up with this group of municipalities. But the important thing here is that within each state, we were able to randomly assign one of these municipalities to the federal auditor, one to the central auditor, and the other three were pure control. So we were in agreement with the auditors that nothing would happen in the other municipalities. The process of randomization had to be objective, replicable, and verifiable. This is slightly different on what happens in other field experiments, because in other field experiments you say have a public lottery or something like that, and that way you can assign treatment and control. But here we needed it to be replicable because the auditors need to defend their work in the lower house of Congress. So the lower house of Congress needs to be able to replicate the selection criteria. So that means that we were bounded to work with the technological infrastructure and limitations of the lower house of Congress. So in that way, what we ended up doing was assigning municipalities lottery tickets, so basically assigning digits to municipalities. And then we used the winning numbers of the Mexican National Lottery to assign treatment and control. So this was completely replicable, and anyone with Excel could reproduce this assignment. Okay, so our data comes from routine audit reports. It comes from expenditure data reported by the Statistical Office in Mexico and the Ministry of Finance. And the survey that I mentioned among public officials in Mexico, we surveyed the mayor, the treasurer, director of public services, the director of public works, and the director of urban planning. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the results. So if there are no questions, should I just move forward? All right, so the first thing that I want to show you is that it is the case that central auditors are more effective in detecting, more strict than local auditors. So what I'm showing you here is by dependent variable. So remarks resolved, money planned to recover, and money actually recovered. I'm showing you the mean in the group that was audited by the state auditors, the group that was audited by federal auditors, and then the difference in means. And I'm showing you two p-values here, one that comes from a parametric simple t-test, and another that comes from a non-parametric test called the Jonter test. So we were particularly concerned here with the small sample size that we have, and so that's why in our pre-analysis plan we specified that we were going to begin by asking very minimal things from the data, so very non-parametric to begin with, and we would move to more parametric tests. So here I'm showing you the last step, which is the difference in means with the t-test, but I'm also showing you the non-parametric p-value. Okay, so starting on the first row, what you see is that indeed federal auditors give more remarks than state auditors. So in average, they give 7 more remarks. And they resolve more of those remarks than the state auditor. So state auditors resolve 2 of the 14 remarks that they give, and federal auditors resolve 17 of the 21 remarks that they give. Now, in terms of money that they plan to recover, both the state and federal auditors roughly detect about the same amount of money. This is roughly an average of 8.3, 8.5 million pesos per audit, but it turns out that federal auditors are way more effective at recovering money, so they recover 2.1 million pesos more than the state auditors.
Anna, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So how much variation is within the state auditors group? Or is this average having a high standard variation in the group that was assigned a state auditor, or they look pretty much the same across states?
Well, remember, all of this variation that I'm using here for the p-values is within state, because that's how we randomize. So yes, there are states that could have more efficacious local auditors, but that would not be confounded with this because this is within state. Yeah. But one interesting question is, are there heterogeneous effects by how effective the systems of local oversight are? So that's something that we could do, but that just speaks to heterogeneous effects.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, Darren?
So in terms of this money recovered, I'm curious why this is. Do federal auditors have more state power behind them? Like, is it just easier for them to bring like a federal agent to collect money, or how that works? Like, what's the mechanism behind that? Or do you think it's some other mechanism with why local auditors are able to collect some?
So I'll get to a little bit of that towards the end when I talk about what public officials say in the survey. But I'll tell you now that being audited by a federal auditor makes people more likely to say they are accountable to the auditor's office, but being audited by the state doesn't make you feel accountable to the state. So our sense is that state auditors have less credentials as independent actors from the state. And so in that sense, local governments don't take them that seriously as federal auditors.
So a related question that I've had in my mind for a minute here. At the beginning, you kind of mentioned that you kind of have this hypothesis that local auditors may have more local knowledge so that they could find more problems, or they could be more sensitive to local politics. Another thing that I was curious about is, are they less well-trained as federal auditors? Like, is there a higher standard? Like, could we just be dealing with less capable auditors at the state level, or do they look like the same at the federal level?
Yeah, so my sense is that federal auditors, in terms of human capital, might look similar. However, they have longer careers as auditors than local auditors. So federal auditors, in average, the ones that we work with have been working with the same federal auditor for a really long time. But there is more rotation among local auditors. So part of it could be captured by local politics, and part of it could be that they are less staffed and have less resources to do their work. So we can't really disentangle those two things because they correspond one-to-one with the two levels of auditors. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe you already said this, but what is the expected sanction or penalty if municipalities don't give money back?
So in the worst case, you can face criminal charges.
But like in real terms, like
Yeah.
you know that it will be prosecuted, or
Well, there will be an initiation of charges. So this is one of the things that even the auditors themselves are frustrated with. So since they started having the mandate of auditing municipalities in 2005, they have started hundreds of procedures against municipalities. And of those, very few of them had actually ended in people getting into prison or people forced to give back the money that they presumably stole. So my sense is that what is more painful for local governments is just dealing with the auditors and more so than dealing with the criminal procedures that can come afterwards. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. I was just curious about Darren's question. How do you if you start a career, is it typical that you would start as a municipal or state official and then move into federal audit?
No.
So it's a different track.
It's a completely different track. So federal auditors typically begin their careers in the federal office
As
federal auditors, and then they move from within the ranks in the federal auditor's office. Local auditors typically are coming from state government bureaucracies.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different track. Yeah. And that's why it's very likely that at the local level, they are way more connected to the governor or to the mayor than a federal auditor who's coming from Mexico City. Yeah. Now, this is along the same lines. What is showing you is that in the actual end report, the federal auditors are way stricter than the central auditors. So, for instance, the federal auditors gave 0 clean assessment to municipalities, and they gave about 30% of negative assessment. So in this negative assessment, it's quite common to see remarks that end up in the initiation of a criminal procedure. On the other hand, the state auditors give about 30-30 of clean and negative assessments. So we're really talking about very different standards that they have.
Sorry, there's like no difference in kind of what these like offices are requiring their auditors to do. Like there's no rule, no incentive for federal auditors to bring back more problems.
That is a good point. So because these audits are all part of the national program of audits, the auditors are supposed to be looking for the same types of irregularities, for the same types of, they're supposed to be doing the same type of audit. And there is no system of bonus points for how much corruption you detect. Now, in parallel to this system that I'm describing, state auditors have their own programs of audits. So they run in parallel, they run independently their own system of audits. Now there's quite a bit of variation on how that works. So that's why when I mentioned that it was important to have 3 municipalities that auditors had the commitment of keeping them as controls, is precisely because the state auditors have their own system. So it was important to keep those controls as real controls, even from a state auditor's oversight. Yeah. Okay, so now the effect on spending. Now, notice here that I am having one more column. So this is the column of the pure controls that I was just talking about, because this data comes from spending data reported by the Ministry of Finance and the Statistics Office. So now I can have data not just on the treatment groups, but now I can have data on the control. So in this first slide, what I'm showing you is how spending on various categories of spending that are not overseen by the auditors. I'm showing you how these categories of spending see no change across groups. So these are things like, for instance, money directed to wages or office supply or general services. There are no statistically differences between the control group or either of the treatment groups. Now, in this one, what I'm showing you is the effect on the categories of spending that are actually overseen by the auditors. The first row there is money spent on social infrastructure. And we didn't break up the data in the categories. This is exactly how the Ministry of Finance presents it. So there is no judgment on our part on what is what. So in terms of social infrastructure, what we see is that if you're audited by the local auditor, the state auditor, there is no effect. But municipalities audited by the federal auditor see a decrease of 20 percentage points in the money spent on social infrastructure. So just to put this number into perspective, in the control group, the average percentage directed to this type of spending was about 40%. So what this is showing you a reduction in half of the money that is directed to social infrastructure. There's really no effect on transfers. These are transfers for education, health, and hospitals. And then this data set on spending has an interesting category. Being very generous by translating it as social assistance, because the actual category in Spanish is called ayudas, or sort of a less generous translation would be handouts or something like that. So what are the kinds of things included here? Well, the school lunches that I was describing before, or programs to fund to deliver construction materials to households. So these are the kinds of things that are included in this category of spending. And what we see here is that being audited by the federal auditors produces a really big increase in this type of spending. To put things into perspective, at baseline, municipalities direct 9% of their resources to this. So this 1.8 coefficient that we have here represents a doubling of the baseline increase directed to this type of spending. So what we think is happening is that municipalities are redirecting resources to categories of spending where there is actual infrastructure so that the auditors can physically visit and audit. And they are moving the spending to areas where it's very hard to audit because the only thing that is available to audit those expenditures is the paper trail that is left behind. Now, I should notice that we don't really know if this is happening because municipalities are stealing all the money, and so what is happening is that they're displacing and stealing, or whether what is happening is precisely what O'Donnell was very afraid of, that municipalities know that the auditors, federal auditors, are harsher. They want to comply with the law, and they think it's very hard to comply with the law. And so let's redirect resources to an area where it's relatively easier to be in compliance. So we can't really distinguish those two motivations behind this displacement. So it probably is a little bit of both. Okay, so now why this is happening? So going back to Darren's question before, excuse me, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. So back to why this is happening. So now this is part of the survey. And what I'm showing you here in this graph is just the raw data. But so all the bars is the raw data in the municipalities. And here I'm reporting the p-value from the parametric test of the difference between the municipalities audited by the federal auditor and the control group. In the first question that we have on the graph on the right is whether municipalities or public officials feel accountable to the auditor's office. And what we see is that there is actually an increase in officials that say once they were audited by the auditor's office, they feel more accountable to it. This one I included just for fun. So we have questions about how responsive you feel to your residents, like in urban areas, in rural areas, in the cabecera municipal, and you typically find a really flat line. This is the residents that public officials feel the most accountable to. The urban residents in rural areas is almost 0%. And there is no effect of whether you are audited or not. Okay, one thing that is happening is that once the public officials have been audited, especially by the Federal Auditor's Office, they tend to estimate that the probability of being audited again in T+1 and T+2 is higher than public officials who are in control. So they do get the sense that once you're in the eye of the auditor's office, it's likely that you're going to have the auditors again, if not next year, the following year. And something slightly similar happens with the state auditors. Now, notice here that almost 80% of public officials expect a visit from the state auditors, and that's because, as I was mentioning before, there is that parallel program of state auditors, and every year they have contact with municipalities. Oftentimes it's very superficial, but this is happening all the time. Now, this is to test the federal auditors' hypothesis that their effect runs through soft touch strategies. Okay, so in the survey, we had questions about the rules that they need to follow to spend the social infrastructure fund. And it turns out that there is a very, very minimal effect on knowledge acquisition. But for the most part, public officials in municipalities know very well the rules of the fund. This one, we were trying to see whether there was an effect in capacity. And contrary to our expectations, what we see is that, if anything, being audited makes officials feel that they have less capacity than what they thought in the control group. So the extent of perceived capacity comes down, but the effect is very minimal. But if anything, it goes against what we were expecting. Now, we were also wondering whether what happens is that preferences for public spending change once you have interacted with an auditor that is telling you how things should be done, but there is no such an effect whatsoever. So we asked people, how would they split spending between public goods, private goods, and club goods, and there's absolutely no effect. If anything, there's a little bit more of a perception that borders want more public goods than private goods and club goods. But yet we see that in the revealed preferences, so actual spending, they are not moving spending towards public goods, they're moving spending towards private goods. Okay, so far, what have I showed you? I've showed you that central auditors are more effective at detecting irregularities and recovering money than local auditors. But I've showed you that local governments respond to these harsher auditors by displacing spending, which I guess underscores the importance of understanding the institutional design of these oversight agencies and comes back to O'Donnell's concern that it's not necessarily the case that more oversight is welfare enhancing. So the effects are more nuanced than that. So one of the reasons why it's been really, really hard to finish this project is because in addition to the data that I have already described, we also have panel data, quarterly data on local projects funded by municipalities, which we need to grab up these questions about what really is happening with this displacement. So with this data, we can actually know not only the broad category of spending, but we can know exactly what types of projects are being sacrificed by this displacing of resources. But working with this data set has been a nightmare, and it has taken us literally years to get into a shape that we can work with. So that's one of the things that we still have on the works. And then we want to figure out some other interesting sort of heterogeneous effects, like, is this effect all driven by those auditors that get bad reports? So that are the bad performing ones, the ones that are displacing the spending? Are the effects driven by those municipalities in their last year in office or in the first year in office? That's something that might be important. We want to see what's the effect among elected officials and non-elected officials. And sort of going back to the political mechanism that some people are already thinking about, we want to see what happens with municipalities that are aligned with the governor and municipalities that are not aligned with the governor, to get a little bit of a better sense about what's driving the behavior of the state, the local auditors. And so if people are curious, my next project has a similar flavor, but it's now in Argentina, so I'm moving countries, and I'm happy to talk more about that one if people have questions. So let me leave it there, and thank you.